What is the nature of miracles? What do we believe about miracles? That's a conversation. Some people struggle with miracles. Thomas Jefferson famously removed all the miracles of Jesus in the Gospels. Like,
oh, I didn't know that.
He's super deconstructed. Like,
Wow.
so, like,
Super
that.
yeah,
Tommy. He literally cut them out of his Bible.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Everyday Theology, the place where we take deep theological questions and turn them into everyday conversations. I am Dr. Reve Wilson, and I am joined as always by my dear brothers, Brandon Cleaver and Jacob Lay. Hi, how are we doing today?
Good.
I'm okay.
Oh,
why?
Just okay.
I'm feeling a little, there's this M word, and there's not a state that comes after it on Dr. Reve's shirt, so it's yeah, you feeling a little, there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance that I'm feeling right now, but
is
I
that
love
because
you.
That's why I'm orienting this way.
Okay, I appreciate it.
So I just felt like
I see how it is.
Yeah, but it's at least not those colors.
You can't even say maize and blue, like you can't even do it?
No.
Why?
So, because I just can't.
Yeah. Why?
My favorite Michigan joke, this will get me in trouble and lose half my audience, is if somebody asks what color is maize. I heard. Did you know this one?
I think it. Yeah.
What color is maize? It's an arrogant shade of yellow.
Oh. Okay, I have a.
Might have to cut that.
No,
just cut that one out.
No, I want to keep
Brandon
it.
liked it.
I want to keep
it.
it.
Did it.
No, I want to keep it because this leads into a question that I have. Okay, we really need to talk about this because with college football, I've noticed something in the Big Ten, especially with the represented schools that we have right here, with me being
State
Michigan, Ohio State, Michigan State. If you haven't figured it out,
and
Jacob,
just so we're clear, we're in it for the jokes. That's the only.
Yes, we
that's
love
the thing we love the most.
Oh
the
yeah.
Jokes.
Yes.
Nothing but love here, but like, okay, so when Ohio State has been like pretty good consistently. Like I will admit it. I'm not gonna like.
I know that was hard for you.
Yeah, it was very difficult for me. Like I might need therapy. But whenever they make it to like the championship, all my Ohio State friends are always like, "You always have to root for the Big Ten. Like it's good for our conference. Root for the conference because then it brings us more money." But then when Michigan was in that boat last year, all my Ohio State friends were like, "We hate Michigan," and I'm like, "Oh, well, what about the conference?" So can you answer this question? Like, what's your deal?
We're hypocrites? I don't know what the correct answer is.
Oh.
I wish I could give you insight. Yeah.
So
I mean, at the end of the day, I would say root for the Big Ten. There might be Ohio State fans that disagree with that, but we all can agree no one likes the SEC.
That's true.
We can all
very
three
true.
collectively agree on that. And they don't care that we say that because they love themselves so much that it doesn't.
That they love themselves so much for like everybody.
That's right. So there's no problem. We've just alienated every college football fan that ever listened to this.
Please continue listening to the actual episode.
Yeah, exactly.
We also learned that unless I ask you to a theological question, you have no idea the answer.
This is true. Yes.
It gives you an insight into what we think.
Okay, well,
most of the time.
earlier in this conversation, you may have heard a voice from afar.
Yes.
Because we have a production crew here.
Yeah.
Like one of the guys on our show, Garrett, he loves to have deep conversations as well. And if you guys watching could ever see it, like always in between takes and everything, you guys are always talking about things. And one topic that we've discussed like recently just in our office here and amongst like our friends is this idea of deconstructing your faith. It seems like there's like a big movement happening in the Christian world. And I think deconstruction maybe stems far outside of just the Christian faith, but we can get into that later. But there's this whole movement of people kind of taking a step back and like looking at their faith and saying, okay, do I really believe this? And why? And we hear that word deconstruction, and I think we think of like, those big name people like your Michael Gungers and some of those who have taken it to an extreme to where they don't even believe in God or in Jesus anymore. And so I think we sometimes have like a negative connotation for it, or we don't really understand what it means, or we just assume it to be one thing versus the other. And in those conversations that we've all had, it kind of brought an idea to my mind that maybe we should talk about it here, because if we're having those conversations, then clearly other people probably are too. And so I kind of want to talk about this idea. And so, Brandon, I mean, when we talk about deconstructing and deconstructing our faith, like, what does that mean?
Yeah. One of the things I really appreciate about, your introduction was all the nuances around this issue, because there is, like many things, there is the current cultural conversation around the topic, and then there's sort of the roots of it and all of that. So I think it's important to talk about that. So, excuse me, as far as the roots go, this term of deconstructionism and things like that, it finds its roots in the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and he sought to.
This is why he's the theologian.
Literally, though, I'm not kidding you. Every episode, Brandon comes up with these names just out of nowhere, and I'm like,
I didn't come up with it. Trust me.
What? How do you remember all these like philosophical people? Like
a lot of boring nights, that's for sure. A lot of boring nights. But he talked about the way, we often talk about as Christians that we see the world through our Christian lenses, right?
Yeah.
And so. Deconstructionism through Derrida was challenging the assumptions that we have of the world, but not, again, challenging the world necessarily, but the lenses through which we see the world. Okay, so that's how he would see deconstructionism. Now, in our current context, particularly within the context of Christianity, and listen, there's going to be a lot of different definitions, a lot of different ways, and we're going to get into some of the nuances as this conversation continues. But at a very base level, it has to do with the critical reexamination of our faith or aspects of our faith. Now, there's many different implications. There's many different degrees of deconstruction. Even someone like Father Richard Rohr, he talks about how deconstruction, in some ways, is part of the Christian journey. In some ways. So he talks about 3 phases: construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction. Construction would be the initial formation of one's faith and one's beliefs and things like that. Deconstruction would be the analyzing those beliefs and even I guess discarding some of those previously held beliefs. The reconstruction would then be the application of new paradigms. So just to give like maybe 2 quick examples from my own life. When I started studying Christian apologetics, many years ago, and then I want to try and keep this as vague as possible because I don't want people to think about any particular professor or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But there were certain folks who taught it in a certain way, and I naturally, starting out, adopted that way and started to apply it in that way because that's what I learned. After my experiences, both personally with individuals and then also engaging the Bible more, going to Moody, and then developing a more robust theological backing to go with the more philosophical apologetics, I started to reevaluate the way I thought about apologetics and the way that I was applying it. So now I apply it, hopefully, in a more pastoral way that people can feel in their daily lives. Mm-hmm. So that's, for me, a story of deconstruction and reconstruction, a healthy story of deconstruction and reconstruction. And then one other one that might make sense is you probably heard of the Christian author Philip Yancey. Mm-hmm. He recently came out with a memoir called When the Light Fell, but one of his initial books is The Jesus I Never Knew. Now, When the Light Fell goes into a lot of background on his childhood, how he grew up in a very racist church. His mother was in fact racist. He had these teachings of Jesus, these sort of Teddy Ruxpin, very teddy bear, very superficial teachings about Jesus. Mm-hmm. And his initial book, The Jesus I Never Knew, really unpacked how he deconstructed from those initial beliefs that he had. And after a while, I think it was in like early college years, he reconstructed, and now he's one of the most probably well-known Christian writers of the last 15, 20 years or so. Yeah. So those are some healthy stories about deconstruction. And I wanted to point those out initially because in some of the circles I run in, there's always, to your earlier point, a negative connotation about deconstruction. Right. And part of that is because in our in what we experience now is that there's been a lot of high-profile individuals who, Christian worship leaders and pastors, who have deconstructed and left the faith. So that's
from what you say, like in the example of your personal life, and I think Jacob and I could both say we probably have our own moments of deconstructing our own faith, but like and reconstructing it. But to me, it doesn't seem like it's a bad thing. But could it become a bad thing, Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where I appreciate the way you started, Brandon, because I think we have to acknowledge that there is a healthy process that we all go through in regards to our faith, because I think if not, then there's people that go through seasons of a little bit of deconstruction towards reconstruction that can become a little bit really disorienting.
Right.
As you're trying to figure that out. So that's good. But yeah, it can move unhealthy. It can move to a place. And I think at the end of the day, what we have to be aware of that can move deconstruction to an unhealthy place is really seeking to say what's underneath why I'm deconstructing, and what am I aiming towards in that.
What do you mean? Well, I was gonna say elaborate on that a little bit.
I mean, again, part of it, but maybe it's helpful even to understand as we have these conversations and wrestle with this, like, what is the nature of deconstruct? The idea of deconstruction comes out of really, in some sense, postmodern theory, which says meaning. There's no absolute truth out there. There's no revealed truth that I'm aiming to try to understand about the nature of the world, reality, create, like all of that. That's all that meaning is derived from within me. So deconstruction becomes a way of, I have to deconstruct my view to then discover and affirm a kind of general meaning or whatever. So at the heart of that, though, becomes, quote, a rejection of any revealed truth. That's the nature of its original underpinning. So I know this, not to get too technical, but I think it's helpful to understand, because I think when we get into the unhealthy aspects of deconstruction, what we oftentimes will buy into that idea. And suddenly what happens is we begin to deconstruct to a point where we go, oh, this is meaningless. There is no absolute. This is your opinion and my opinion.
Right.
This is your truth and my truth.
Yeah.
There is no truth. Now, what we're aware of, which unfortunately we've seen it in a kind of rise of popularity in Christian deconstruction that we've seen recently with some of these popular. But really, at the end of the day, what they've done is they've adopted the deconstruction inherent from the culture, and it's driven them to a place to only adopt the value of the culture. So the culture says there's no revealed truth, and they simply adopted the way in which the culture says that's how you get there, and then they've applied that to their faith, and it's led them to a place to say, well, there's no absolute truth.
Yeah.
That's where it's like, what's underneath that, right? Deconstruction isn't bad, but where's that deconstruction coming from, and what's it aiming towards?
Right.
Are the questions I think we have to wrestle with.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback your point about sort of the underpinnings of it, one of my previous professors, Dr. Gary Habermas, he's done a lot on resurrection and stuff like that. Michigan State alum, go green.
Good for him. We love that.
I got to throw that in there. But excuse me. But a lot of his initial work dealt with doubt. And one of his first books was called The Thomas Factor. And he talks about these 3 levels of doubt, because oftentimes deconstruction is almost synonymous with doubt. And so, again, to Jacob's point about like what's actually underneath that, and like us sort of mining the reasons behind the deconstruction, he talks about these three phases of doubt, right? So factual, emotional, and volitional. Factual would be dealing with the actual like tenets of Christianity, the foundations of the faith. Volitional would be dealing with our will, or literally our willingness to our willingness to adhere to actually be a disciple of Christ, and those types of things. Like, do we really want to? And then emotional, and this is where a lot of people find it in. I think this more goes to your point about subjectivism, the inherent subjectivism of deconstructionism often, is that there's this emotional underpinning of how do I feel about the faith, or how do I feel about aspects of the faith, and it's not a necessary correlation with the facts of the faith. Now, there can also be a mishmash of these things as well, but I think also identifying which of these or which mix of these one is going through, especially if you know someone who's going through this process, will help you to sort of create a game plan and helping to walk through this process with them.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring it in the doubt factor too, because I do think that's where a lot of it stems from, at least, in my story or in conversations I've had with friends, like they doubt something about either the character of God, the nature of God, or something the Bible says. Like you have these friends who are like, yeah, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, but like, did a sea really part? Like, were there 5,000 fish? Like, or he fed 5,000 people with 2 fish or whatever, like some of those things in the Bible, they like really doubt or struggle with. And so, that idea of truth becomes a little blurred.
Yeah.
And I know, like, I had a therapist once tell me, love therapy, highly recommend it. Once tell me that like a lot of times our feelings, albeit maybe valuable in that moment, they're oftentimes not true. Like they're masking some type of truth in our life. Like we feel that something is affecting us in one way, but the truth of the matter is very different. And so when I think of this idea of like deconstructing, I almost, what makes me nervous about it is how then people might pick and choose the truths about Jesus or the Bible or about the Christian faith that they want, and then leave others behind because it doesn't fit with
like their own
and their own,
And that's one of the things I struggle with it, and and that's where I want to be careful in this conversation, because I don't want to project the idea that somebody that's in a process of working through some deconstruction towards reconstruction, that there's some sort of judgment, or that's a real emotional reality. That's a real struggle that people are working through. So we're not coming and saying like, oh, well, everybody that does that has this malicious thing underneath.
Right.
That's not true. We know that. We've been on those journeys ourselves. But I think one of the things that what I want to try to encourage though is like, let's be honest though with what we're actually seeking and wrestling with. And that's where I think your delineation between those realities is helpful, because I was recently listening to a popular podcast from a while back where a guy was sharing his deconstruction story, and he was wrestling with the nature of science and faith, and what he was getting from science, where that lined up with faith. And I was listening to it, the struggle. I could empathize with the struggle. We all have some of those questions. We feel that tension. And I think at some point we're going to dialogue about a little bit more about what that looks like.
For sure.
But he at one point makes a statement that he had received from a resource or book on science, contrary to this. And then he says at one point, there are answers to this that are given by creationists. But I essentially went this way. And I sat there for a moment and thought, whoa, like that's, I wish I didn't have a chance to dialogue with him because I was listening to a podcast.
So you dialogued in your car while you were driving.
This is what I do normally.
Yes, of course.
But I thought like, oh, I wish I could pause right there, because that's the question that I would want to ask, to say, well, hold on. If there is an answer out there, let's be honest about that. Why are you choosing this answer if you're also recognizing there are answers given?
Right.
So that's where the same thing. It's not that there's not answers, or there isn't a reality of tension. So you want to talk about the feeding of the 5,000, how miracles work. That's a miracle. What is the nature of miracles? What do we believe about miracles? That's a conversation. Some people struggle with miracles. Thomas Jefferson famously removed all the miracles of Jesus in the Gospels. Like,
oh, I didn't know that.
He's super deconstructed. Like, he literally cut them out of his Bible. So there's that aspect to you, but then you want to pause there and say, well, what is the Christian answer to miracles? And if I'm going to turn from that, I'm going to deconstruct that, not go to reconstruction. Have I been honest about why I'm rejecting those answers? Because I think that's where we don't always have honest conversation. It almost can come across like, well, I'm seeking truth. And sometimes I go, are you? Because I'm not hearing why you're rejecting this answer. I'm just hearing, I like this one better. Well, that might be more of a feeling thing than a truth thing. That might be, and again, it's not a statement of judgment. I'm just saying, let's all be honest about what we're actually trying to wrestle with and where we're trying to aim
we
at.
need to ask ourselves. And I think that when maybe there's people who are listening to this conversation who are in the process of deconstruction, or maybe there's people who are watching who know people who are. Right. I mean, like, what are the questions? And I kind of want to ask both of you this. We can start with you, Brandon, but like, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this. There's like, what are the questions that we need to be like asking ourselves as we wrestle through some of these tensions we find in our faith?
Yeah. Before I get to that, I want to pick up one thing that you said. I think that's really important. When you're wrestling through this and you're turning from it, it's not just about what you're turning from, it's about what you're turning to. It's funny, that reminds me of a 90s R&B song, I think by Escape, Who Do You Run To? Something like that. I don't know. Showing my age a little bit here. Anyway, so it is about what are you turning to? Okay, so when we think about the four most important questions or themes of our life that every worldview, every religion, every faith has to answer: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Those are the four and most important things. Like you mentioned, science, the Bible never purported to be a science book. So whether we're in a old universe or a new universe, that shouldn't cause us to deconstruct from our faith in a way that leads us to disavowing our faith altogether, right? But what are those core things? And so I think that, like you mentioned, we have to be honest with ourselves. Are the reasons that we're leaving the Christian faith or seriously questioning it and therefore turning to something else? Because you're always turning to something else. Some people think that, I was in a conversation recently with someone who went through a similar process and now they're atheists. And I'm like, but they look at atheism as like a default. Like, no, it's not a default. It has its own set of implications and ways that a world devoid of God, how you can think about things. So are the reasons that you left Christianity better fulfilled or answered in atheism or in, whatever religion or worldview? So anyway, I just wanted to point that out and piggyback your points there. Now, sorry, to your question.
Yes, enlighten me.
Your question was, what are the questions that we should be thinking about with someone who's going through this?
Or just ourselves.
Ourselves.
I think both and. Because, I think sometimes, I would personally say, from my experience, if you're questioning things in your faith, always bring someone else into it. I mean, having someone who you trust, who can like walk through some of that stuff with you and answer those questions. I just personally found, for me, that was like very helpful to have friends who were very secure and understood and knew the Word of God to be like pointing me to truth in my questions. But so yes, maybe the questions we should be asking people, but the questions that like we ourselves should be asking as we maybe deconstruct our own faith.
Yeah. I mean, I can give you the hardest one, which is not probably the least fun question to have a conversation around, but often is one of the most pertinent. Yeah. Is the question, is there a moral reason under my deconstruction? So I think oftentimes as a Christian, we would say the core brokenness of humanity is we have turned from obedience to God, His word, His ways, to ourselves. That's a moral turning, right? And oftentimes our biggest struggle with God comes in the moral realm, where we do not want to follow what He has created, what He says, what we're waited. We want to follow what we determine. And now this isn't exclusive, so I think we want to be careful again. But a lot of times in the conversations that I have, we mask the intellectual elements of deconstruction when the real element underneath is moral. So I did college ministry for a number of years, and I remember having these questions, and again, not exclusively, but I distinctly remember one conversation I had with a guy who was deconstructing at the time. And the whole reason he wanted to deconstruct because he wanted to sleep with his girlfriend. And we were like, no, that's not what God says. Yeah. And sometimes I wonder if we don't, and again, it's not to characterize, but like, if we're not honest to say, I actually really struggle with what the word of God says in a moral character in this way, but then I move towards I've got all this intellectual stuff I'm going to go. So it's going to become this, but at its core, I have a moral problem with a God that would say that I have to do this, or the world is this way,
or
when I
that
want
this
it to be
is a
this
sin,
way.
or that this
That's a
is
sin.
yeah.
And it's hard. Let's just acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Because that's the least comfortable conversation we have with people. It's much easier to have a conversation about what I intellectually struggle with than like, what do I actually morally feel in relationship
But
to
I
God.
do feel like that now that I'm like looking back at my story, or like other friends who I know who are walking through it. I mean, at the end of the day, like, I think it does really circle back to that. Now, I know that there's like a whole nother side of deconstruction too, where people are deconstructing from Islam, or deconstructing from being an atheist and being like, hey, maybe I do believe in God. It's not just limited to Christianity, but I think when we look at it from a Christian perspective, that question that you just brought up, I feel like really does encompass it, and it is one that we really should be asking ourselves and asking the people in our lives is what really is at the root of it, because maybe if we peel back those layers, we do find things like that where people are talking about those different moral issues or sins that maybe they struggle with, that they want to find some justification in.
And we're really good at deceiving ourselves. So I always wonder, like, if we were honest in periods of deconstruction, to go to someone and say, hey, why do you think I'm struggling with this? What do you see in my life that might be causing me to ask these questions? That person might be able to give us a window a little bit to maybe some of that stuff that remains a mystery to us. And maybe they might say, hey, I know you went through a really hard time. I know there are probably some things in your life that might cause you to question God in these areas. Let's talk about it. Like, they might actually have a window, if they know you, into reasons you might not fully understand. Again, that's a hard place, but I think sometimes, at least I know, I'll speak for myself. I can't speak for everyone. When I've been in periods of deconstruction, my natural tendency is to want to cover those up instead of actually being vulnerable with what maybe, and honest about what's underneath why I'm in that season. But that's actually where we can find the answers we're looking for, and that's actually where God, I think, meets us in periods of deconstruction. So
and the Bible talks about, the heart being deceptive, and a lot of times it's hard for us to face that reality of what we're experiencing or what we're thinking, and that introspection is so important. But like you said, it's hardest a lot of times to be honest as honest with ourselves as we need to be, or we just aren't aware, because we need to be living in community. I think in a episode from season 1, you talked a lot about, I can't remember the subject that we talked about, but you talked a lot about how community and a communal life, and as my pastor going to your church, I know we've had conversations where you even talk about the importance of, the community groups of the church. The Christian life is to be lived in community. And so, engaging in that is really important. Just to piggyback, your points there, one other thing I think that another reason, and there's many really, but another thing that we can look at is really the church's failings as well. Because I do think for a lot of people, and some in the circles that I run in, it's how the church has in some time, particularly here in America where we are, has failed to really be the church that Christ has called us to be, whether it's conflations or unhealthy relationships with certain political parties, whether it's the racial, ethnic dynamics that have been an issue in our country and continue to be somewhat of an issue, whether it's how we frame things around certain cultural discussions, whether it be LGBTQ, issues, whatever. And that's not to say that we should compromise, but it's also the way in which we convey those too. So there are some times, I think, too, where the church's failings lead people to say, do I really want to be a part of that? Now, at that point, we have to say, hey, who's failing? Is Christ failing, or are Christians failing? Who are you following? Are you following Christ, or are you following Christians? And so we can acknowledge the fact that Christ came for those who are in need, for those who are sick and needy, the sinful. And so Christians are expected to sin, but ultimately, it's Christ who we follow, and that's who our model is. As Paul said in First Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, follow my example, for I follow the example of Christ. So
yeah. For sure. This has been a really great conversation, and I appreciate, the honesty and transparency that you both gave in your answers. And if you're watching this and you're in a season of deconstructing your faith, please invite someone along with you on that journey. I mean, reach out to us, any one of us. But we would love to have those conversations with you and walk alongside of you in this season of your life and help you reconstruct your faith and not walk away from it. And so, gentlemen, again, thank you so much. Just for this conversation today. I know it was kind of a tough one, but we like to
right?
We like to do that here. We like to do that here.
Well, we have the scholar Jacob over here talking about postmodernism and all these things.
Right?
I can't even pronounce the name you use.
Whenever you guys say those big words, I'm like, this is great. But anyways, we're gonna have resources available for you in the post copy of this episode, as well as a blog written by Brandon, just kind of diving deeper into this. And so again, if you have questions, please drop comments, reach out to us. We would love to help you answer those. So thanks for joining us here at Everyday Theology, and we can't wait to see you again soon.